Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at the Picture of Dorian Gray, looking at a closer analysis of chapter 2. So chapter 2 is the characters are still in Basil Hallward's studio, but now Dorian Gray has entered the scene, and Dorian is there to sit for Lord Henry, to sit for Basil, so Basil can finish off the painting. And as it happens, Lord Henry's still there, and he stays to talk to Basil, and in their discussions, he reveals to, I can't get my characters right. Dorian talks to Lord Henry, stays to talk to Dorian while Basil is finishing painting. That's how it goes, and so he then exposes Dorian to these ideas that Dorian had never really thought of before, chiefly about the nature of youth and beauty and pleasure and morality and temptation and all these ideas that Dorian had never thought of in that way before. And the chapter ends when Dorian abandons his plans to spend time with Basil in favor for Lord Henry, which is kind of a hint of what's to come in terms of their relationship. Okay. So Lord Henry has heard about Dorian. Remember in the first chapter, he observes the painting and he says he's like an Adonis, a Narcissus. And when he sees him, yes, he confirms he's certainly wonderfully handsome with finely curved scarlet lips, frank blue eyes, and crisp gold hair. So kind of this ideal mold of man. And Lord Henry also observes that he looks like he's got, like he's untouched by the world. He's unspotted. And you can see why Basil worships Dorian, which Basil has admitted that he does. So Basil then is kind of left with this quandary because Lord Henry says no, he has to get going, and Dorian says no, can't he stay? And so then Basil kind of he says this: Dorian's whims are laws to everybody except himself. And the Dorian that represented within this character in this chapter is kind of represented as almost like quite childlike and petulant. Like he gets what he wants, but he doesn't do it in a manipulative like adult way. It's more of a kind of a petulant child. And so he says to Basil, if Lord Henry Wotton goes, I shall go too. Ask him to stay. I insist upon it. And you never talk to me while you're painting. It's terribly boring for me. So a very sort of immature response, I think. And it happens later in the chapter as well. And of course then Lord Henry stays. He kind of, at this point, he can't help himself because he's become quite enamored with the idea of Dorian. And then in this extract here, Dorian says to Lord Henry, have you really a bad influence, as bad as Basil says? Now, we know that Basil is afraid of Lord Henry's influence on Dorian. If you think about it as like a group of friends where you want to keep somebody for yourself, and you are worried that if they meet some of your other friends who perhaps maybe a little bit more exciting and charismatic than you, that they're going to prefer you. You get that kind of vibe from it. So Lord Henry says one of his aphorisms, one of his little one-liners, he says to Dorian, he says, there's no such thing as a good influence. All influence is immoral, which is quite a bold statement. Not as most of Lord Henry's statements, if you pick it apart, not strictly true. And he says, but from a scientific view, it is, because if you influence a person, you give him one's own soul. Okay, they speak a lot about their soul. Basil says that Dorian has dominated him, like dominated his soul and his personality. And so he says it's immoral to influence somebody because then that person His virtues are not real to him. His sins are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music. And that's quite a nice idea if you look at what happens later in the story, that Dorian does kind of become an echo of Lord Henry, and the kind of the views and the morals that Lord Henry espouses, not necessarily ones that he developed of his own volition. So now we get into some of the things that Lord Henry says to Dorian. Now, these are ideas that Dorian finds quite unusual and quite bewildering. Even here in this extract, you'll see he says there, "Stop, faltered Dorian. You bewilder me. I don't know what to say. Let me think, or rather, let me try not to think." Okay. And this is a response to all sorts of things that Lord Henry has said. He says, it's kind of a joke that I make as well, the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. I sometimes say I can resist anything but temptation, but obviously it's said in jest. "Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful." So here, Lord Henry, essentially what he's talking about is the idea of hedonism. Okay, so hedonism is this school of thought that says you don't need to concern yourself with questions about the moral effects of something or the consequences of it to other people. Like, you do what makes you feel good. You do you, boo. So if it's going to bring you pleasure, then you do it, and you don't need to question it too much. All right. That's hedonism in a nutshell. When I get back to class, we can have discussions about the ideas of hedonism, but I think most of you will agree that in theory, it sounds great. But if you imagine that everybody lived this way, the world would devolve into chaos. Like, we have rules and we have moral laws for a reason. Why? Because we can't just have everyone doing whatever they want all the time just because it feels good. Okay, this could turn into an LO lesson very quickly. So he says to Dorian, even you, Dorian, yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, in other words, your innocence, you have had passions that make you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheeks with shame. So here he's tapping into Dorian's sort of deepest desires and thoughts and saying, you've had them. Can you imagine if you just gave in to them? Now you can see why these ideas would be very confronting to Dorian, somebody who's lived a very sheltered existence and who's only been exposed really as an influence to older people like Lady Agatha, who's a charity worker and his perhaps a tutor of some kind or a governess of some kind, an educator, not much experience out in society. And so these ideas are quite new to him and quite terrifying at first, though he seems to get into the groove of it quite quickly. Right, so for nearly 10 minutes, Dorian stands there motionless, dimly conscious that entirely flesh influences were at work within him. The few words that Basil's friends had said to him had touched some secret chord that had never been touched before. So lovely metaphor there of like him being some sort of instrument, and Lord Henry's like plucked on something and that grrr is reverberating in him and he's vibrating to throbbing and curious pulses. Now I don't think there's the fact that imagery is quite sensual is not incidental, because Lord Henry's talking about doing things that are sensual, doing things that make you feel good. Okay. Yet there have been things in his boyhood that he had not understood, and he understood them now, and life suddenly became fiery colored. Right. It seemed to him that he'd been walking in fire. Why had he not known it? So now he thinks back to those innermost thoughts, feelings, desires, the things that we don't share with people because we're afraid of what they might think of us. And he realizes that Lord Henry's saying you don't have to deny yourself those things. You can give in to them. You can enjoy them. Do it. Okay. I like to imagine Dorian for the rest of the story, like with the little Lord Henry devil sitting on one shoulder and a little Basil angel sitting on the other, and like the society and what people say, and then Lord Henry like, do it, just do it, it'll feel good. Okay. Now, one of the interesting parts of the story I find is the kind of intense pleasure that Lord Henry takes as he sees the influence that he is having on Dorian. So if you think about the metaphor of Dorian being a musical instrument that Lord Henry is just plucking and experimenting on and enjoying the effects it has. And if not for the first time, he compares Dorian to kind of like a scientific experiment. So he says, influence is scientific. Okay, you're putting your soul into somebody. So he feels intensely interested. He was amazed at the sudden impression that his words had produced, and remembering a book that he had read when he was 16, a book which had revealed to him much that he had not known before. I wonder if it's the same book he passes on to Dorian later. And he wondered whether Dorian was passing through a similar experience. Had he merely shot an arrow in the air? Had it hit the mark? How fascinating the lad was. So here Dorian takes on an extra layer of fascination for Lord Henry. It's not just the fascination of his physical beauty, the fascination that he has observing the relationship between Basil and Dorian, and now observing the effect that he himself has on Dorian through the things that he can say to him. And when they go out into the garden and they're speaking, Lord Henry carries on with his ideas, and he says, because he catches Dorian like burying his face in a flower and smelling the intense aroma of this beautiful blossom. And he says, nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. In other words, if you have a longing for something, you have to indulge in something that's going to give you sensual. Remember, there's a difference between sensual and sexual. Sensual pleasures, okay? So listening, seeing, touching, tasting. The lad drew back. There was a look of fear in his eyes, such as people have when they are suddenly awakened. Okay, yes, continued Lord Henry, to cure the soul by the senses, and the senses by the mean of a soul. You are a wonderful creation. Now, a lot of the effect that Lord Henry has at first on Dorian is because he compliments him, and he makes Dorian feel good, and he makes him think that he's special. And he pays him a little bit of extra attention. But it's funny, though, because Lord Henry's doing the same thing that Basil's been doing, but he is not just like adoring, he's also interacting and engaging with Dorian in a more meaningful way. And Dorian finds himself as well, this omniscient narrator tells us that he could not help liking the tall, graceful young man who was standing by him, but he felt afraid of him and ashamed of being afraid. Why it had been left to a stranger to reveal him to himself. He had known Basil Hallward for months, but the friendship between them had never altered him. Suddenly there had someone come across his life who seemed to have disclosed to him life's mysteries. And yet, what was there to be afraid of? He wasn't a child anymore. Okay. Paraphrasing there. So here we've got Dorian have a moment where he feels quite frustrated. He's like, but like it's almost like Basil's been hiding this from me. Why hasn't he been telling me all these wonderful things about life that this Lord Henry guy is now telling me? Obviously, because Basil is not the same kind of person as Lord Henry, and Lord Henry just enjoys messing with people for the sake of it, I think. Okay, and so Lord Henry's talked to him about morality and influence and pleasure and temptation, and now he reveals to him his truths about youth and beauty. So he says to Dorian, you have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having. He kind of reminds me of Barney Stinson. I don't know if you watch How I Met Your Mother, but Barney Stinson's like, what do I always say? What is the one thing I always say? And every time he says it's something different, but he's like tries to make his point that. So he says, someday when you're old and wrinkled and ugly, you will feel it. Now, wherever you go, you charm the world. Will it always be so? You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Don't frown, you have. And beauty is a form of genius. Higher indeed than genius, as it needs no explanation. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here because the program is going to cut me off. We'll pick up from that in a few minutes.